project with much enthusiasm. It happened to be my mother's favorite book, but with decreasing financial or other support. In 2015, then, 15 years after the appearance of CEECT's edition of the Backwoods of Canada, Le Chien d'Or, or Dog, our nickname for it, was published by McGill Queen's University Press, Carleton University Press, having closed in the late 1990s. This 14th and last CEECT edition was well received, especially by experienced scholarly editors. Peter Schillingsberg, who assessed the volume for McGill Queen's, gave it an enthusiastic review. The selection from it, printed on the back cover of Dog's paperback version, reads, for example, Edwards's notes following the text of the novel are a marvel of historical sleuthing and clarity. Together with the introduction, this edition provides the reader with modern historical and textual scholarship of encyclopedic proportions. As a longtime admirer of Schillingsberg's editorial sagacity, I was particularly pleased with his comments on the explanatory notes. That is, notes that help explain the cultural and historical context out of which our English-Canadian works originated. When we were planning the CEECT project in the 1980s, we spent a good deal of time discussing these annotations. Initially, we wondered if we should have them at all. Should we, in other words, follow many editors of American texts who included only textual notes, that is, notes that justify what each editor had done to create what was then often referred to as the definitive text? Having decided to have explanatory notes, we then identified 4 categories of material that should be considered for annotation: literary quotations, actual events, people, and places, words or phrases in foreign languages, ancient and modern, and specialized and erudite diction. Each category came with conditions, however. One that provoked particular interest was, and I'm quoting from my 1985 handbook for editors, because French in Canada is not a foreign language, it should normally not be translated unless the word or phrase represents a particular difficulty. Its meaning is, i.e., its meaning is different in modern French from that in the text. Herbert J. Rosengarten had already warned that while French might not cause concern among the students at Carleton, in Brobdingnag, on the other side of the Rockies, that is in British Columbia where he taught, the natives, even some of the educated ones, looked upon French as a sort of freak of nature. And while as an Australian nationalist, Harold Love sympathized with our privileging the official bilingualism of Canada, at a session on editing at a conference in 2001, he pointed out how strange this stance would seem to his students at Monash University in Melbourne. Using these criteria and their caveats, nevertheless, the editor and the general editor of a CEECT text, as well as a student assigned to the project, each independently made a list of possible annotations that our ideal reader, whom we defined as a Canadian with an interest in literature, although not necessarily a specialist in the subject, might appreciate. The trio, the 3 of us, then met in person to hammer out what should be explained. Actually, these consultations were surprisingly harmonious because despite the fact that the students who participated in this exercise delighted in being dubbed dumb readers, the lists were always similar. Once it was decided what should be explained, we urged that these notes be as focused on fact as possible. That is, they should not be used to enforce a particular critical interpretation, and they should be as short as possible. We did, however, ask that the sources quoted in each explanatory note be identified. Since for several reasons, we decided that our edited text should be clear, that is, without either signs in the lines of the text itself that indicated that relevant information could be found in the paratextual apparatus or footnotes at the bottom of the page, we place these explanatory notes as the first of the paratextual material to appear after the edited text. And we introduce them with a short head note. In Canadian Crusoes, for example, Rupert Scheiders reads in part, "These explanatory notes deal with 2 kinds of material, direct quotations and allusions, and references to specific events, people, and places. The Bible is the most quoted source, but the plays of Shakespeare and of Beaumont and Fletcher and the works of earlier and contemporary English, Scottish, and Irish writers are also represented. Many of the references Mrs. Traill makes to events, people, and places are themselves explained within the text of Canadian Crusoes, and therefore require no additional notes. Notes have been provided, however, for historical events like the Battle of Culloden, for the people in the Peterborough area who Mrs. Traill mentions by name, and for a few places such as the St. John River or Kilvert's Ravine, of which either the identity or location is unclear. The notes are keyed to the text by page and line numbers. Interesting enough, I was reading the headnote for The Golden Dog, and Shakespeare and the Bible are the most frequently quoted texts in that historical novel. Although the what and why of CEECT's explanatory notes, as well as its other paratextual material, remain consistent over the length of the project, by 2012, there were problems. Let me illustrate one by comparing the explanatory notes in the CEECT edition of Canadian Crusoes, which I have described as another Canadian historical novel that functions as a national Canadian epic, in this case about the Canada that existed when Catharine Parr Strickland Traill was composing this work in the early 1850s with William Kirby's Le Chien d'Or. The CEECT edition of Canadian Crusoes consists of 384 pages, of which 60 contain introductory material, including the editor's introduction of 35 pages, 254 the edited text, and 70 the concluding paratextual material. 16 of these pages hold the 70 explanatory notes. The volume, therefore, is light and small enough to be easily held and read. In contrast, I want to drop it. In contrast, the CEECT edition of the Chien d'Or consists of 1,143 pages, of which 172 contain introductory material, including an introduction entitled, and please note the change, Editor's Introduction, The Anatomy of a Novel, of 153 pages that reflects the influence of the history of the book on editing, 755 the edited text, and 172 the concluding paratextual material. 129 of these pages hold the 467 explanatory notes. This volume, therefore, is thick and heavy. It weighs in at about 2 kilograms and is awkward to hold. It remains, as Peter Schillingsberg says, I'm pleased to say, an encyclopedic read. But with the exception of someone like myself and the editors and students with whom I collaborated in the last decades of the 20th century, for whom, despite radio and television, material artifacts were still the main sources of education and entertainment, who will be drawn to this physical lump? And how do we justify this kind of scholarly edition when it is expensive to buy and when an ebook would be so much more convenient, even though, because of the ever-changing nature of digital technology, an artifact printed on acid-free paper might just outlast a digitized version. When we were planning the CEECT project, we considered several issues related to these questions. Because we thought that its cultural and historical context was as important as the changes that had occurred to each author's work, we rejected the idea of only having apparatus that commented upon cruxes regarding the edited text, and therefore moved away from the theories of editing, now mostly associated with Fredson Bowers and to a certain extent Tom Tenzel. Michael Narowski, my colleague in the Department of English, who established and for many years ran Carleton University Press, negotiated, unsuccessfully as it turned out, with Jack McClellan to incorporate our reliable text. In contrast to the Americans, we had never ever called them definitive, because there's always a possibility another manuscript might turn up, into McClellan and Stewart's new Canadian Library series. The paperbacks that were the chief teaching texts in increasingly numerous university courses in Canadian literature. The possibility of such a venture was, in fact, one reason why we had a clear text. We had never thought, of course, of digital editions, but from the beginning of the project, we had used computers from mainframes to laptops and many computer programs written especially for CEECT to prepare our scholarly editions. In 2012, digital humanities and all that this term implies were still in their infancy. I suspect, however, that if someone had suggested then that the seed edition of Dog should be published in two formats, one the edition as it appeared, and the other the clear text in one volume, and the scholarly apparatus, in particular the explanatory notes in a second, we might have considered it. I certainly would have considered it because this book is so big. 10 years later, I still have doubts about the durability of e-text as compared with paper versions. When I was preparing this paper, for example, I checked the references in Le Chien d'Or's published versions of the text, published versions of the work, another section of the concluding paratextual apparatus, that I made to Elizabeth Brady's article, a bibliographical essay on William Kirby's The Golden Dog, which was first published in the papers of the Bibliographical Society of Canada, and to Thomas B. Vincent's Bibliophiles, a bibliographical database of Canadian authors, their publications and editions, which was published online. Brady's article is now available online in several databases that include the papers of the Bibliographical Society of Canada, but Vincent's database has disappeared. If you wish to consult his Kirby bibliography, therefore, you must borrow it in its pamphlet form. Nevertheless, now I should certainly opt for the archival and editorial digital material and editions that Paul has so carefully described and discussed in several of his print publications, and that Roger has written about in The Life of Such as Life, A Cultural History of an Australian Classic, published by Sydney University Press this year. Well, I debate the wisdom, on the other hand, being able to change passages in an edition published in 1986. I should love to rewrite one of Rupert Scheider's explanatory notes, in which he admits his inability to identify a couple of lines of poetry that Catharine, Parr, Strickland, Traill frequently quoted. Thanks to the digitization of so much material, these can now be easily assigned to both an author and a poem. And although I still prefer a clear text, the idea of pushing on a word or phrase in an e-text and being able to access the explanatory notes that come with it would make the reading of a long work like Chien d'Or much easier. In the 10 years since the publication of Dog, there has been not only a revolution in technology, but there has also been changes that might, probably will, alter considerably the approaches to the cultural and historical context out of which these early English Canadian works came. I got a hint of this in 2011, when a doctoral student at Carleton and I spent several weeks proofreading Le Chien d'Or. One of the methods that we used for the explanatory notes was to take turns reading them aloud, periods and other forms of punctuation included. When the student was reading, I could always tell if she was familiar with the contents of the note. Since she had told me that although she was specializing in contemporary English Canadian literature, her first love was the 18th century, I was surprised when she stumbled over the name of Gulliver and seemed totally unfamiliar with Jonathan Swift's canonical work. When I asked her about this, her reply was that her reading of 18th century material did not include Swift. Rather, her 18th century consisted mostly of Jane Austen and other women novelists of her era. Frances Moore Brooke, for example, who published her works in the 1750s and 1760s, was not among them. Since 2012, dead white men have continued to disappear from the 18th century syllabus at Carleton, and this syllabus increasingly emphasizes works published in the early decades of the 19th century, which the so-called long 18th century now includes. It is likely, therefore, that even if we followed CEECT conventions for explanatory notes now, our list would include many more possibilities for both the history of Emily Montague and the Chien d'Or, which is set in Quebec in the 1740s. In the last 10 years, other changes have occurred. One pertains to the reality of Canada as an officially bilingual country. With the province/nation of Quebec declaring itself unilingually French, and a Governor General declaring that her two official languages are English and whatever version of the Inuit language she speaks, and who cannot even read in an acceptable manner the speeches written in French for her, CEECT's decision not to translate words or expressions in French in works like Le Chien d'Or seems quaint, to say the least. A second pertains to the fact that, according to the 2021 census, Most immigrants who arrive in Canada, and the plan is to take in 500,000 a year, are not white Europeans with a Christian background. Rather, they are Arab, Chinese, and Indian with other languages and religions. One may well ask, therefore, how much these epic stories about Christian, largely rural Canadas told in Canadian Crusoes and Le Chien d'Or resonate with these new Canadians, and in a multicultural and urban Canada, how important is it that these works should? A third, possibly the most important change, is the woke movements that have taken over Canadian universities, especially in regard to Indigenous studies. Given the plot of Canadian Crusoes, which accepts marriage between a Native girl and a French-Canadian / Scottish boy only when Indiana becomes a Christian, and lauds the progress made by the white settlers around the Rice Lake Plains in what is now the province of Ontario, an editor who wishes to get a short grant probably would be wise to ignore this work altogether. If he, she, they persisted in preparing a scholarly edition with explanatory notes, even CEECT's criterion would, I suspect, produce very different results from the list that Rupert Scheider, the student, and I came up with in the 1980s. If one is producing a scholarly edition that is meant to last, should an editor then follow the 20th century model of Fredson and Bowers and skip such embellishments as explanatory notes altogether? Especially if one prepares a digital edition that can be changed, should one expect or even rejoice that another person, possibly from a different cultural and historical background, and certainly from a younger generation, will alter the contents of these annotations in ways that the original creator never imagined? Or should a scholarly editor accept that such embellishments as explanatory notes in his, her, their text of a work are themselves dated according to the time that they are prepared? Thus, while they play a crucial role in the history of books like Canadian Crusoes and Le Chien d'Or, they are not as durable as we once thought. For me, these embellishments remain important, but their presence in edited text is still, perhaps now more than ever, open to debate. Thank you.